Jennifer Neeley is a fractional CMO, a strategist, educator, and creator of the Neeley Trust framework, a model for evaluating how trust is built and eroded in high visibility environments. Two-time Emmy nominee, a transition from traditional broadcast journalism to digital strategy in the late 90s. Jennifer teaches digital and influencer marketing at UC San Diego and has spent over 20 years advising high-growth companies in tech, media, and healthcare. She's a host of the Influence podcast, former host of The A-List, which featured guests like Gao Kawasaki and Seth Godin, and is currently writing Generations, a book exploring how generational perspectives shape the way we market, lead, and live. Jennifer holds a master's from Columbia School of Journalism, served in the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan, and is passionate about ethical, trauma-informed digital communication. I've never read an introduction like that. So you're already absolutely unique in everything you've done and what you stand
and
for.
I think you came up with that. You researched that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
so
hopefully
it's
it's
not
true.
me. Hopefully,
No, it's not you
much.
bigging yourself up. It's certainly not. So, and I could have. The first introduction I wrote was a page long. I thought, oh gosh, we're never going to get to record. But I've already enjoyed talking to you before we even hit record. So I'll get to some questions, and then we'll see where we go from there. So I think I'm right in saying you started as a local TV reporter, worked for the big three broadcast networks, served in the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan, and now part of what you do is a fractional CMO teaching influencer marketing at UC San Diego. Do you think is there a thread that connects the different chapters of your career, or have you just gone where desire and opportunities taken you?
It's a good question. I actually think the through line in a way has been shaped a lot by early childhood. So my father died when I was 8 years old, very unexpectedly, and my brother and sister are twins. So I became very parentified, kind of playing the parent role. So it's that pop psychology term of being parentified. I don't see it as a negative. I think I've, hopefully worked through those issues by now that might have felt difficult when I was growing up. But I was always the very responsible one and hopefully very reliable for my siblings. And undoubtedly, the loss of my father had a huge impact on my mother as well. My father died at age 34. My mother's mother, so her mother died at the same age. So my mom was 32 when my dad died. And so that's 2 years after that, when she turned 34, I witnessed this kind of crisis and concern about our safety and, that we were, she still had to work. So she worked as little as she could 2 days a week. And so I saw her through line, and there was a lot of corporate layoffs, a lot of, I'm a Gen Xer, a lot of what Gen Xers saw, which, just conditioned not to believe that corporations were going to take care of me, or that there was any sense of, especially after I had been an exchange student in Sweden, that there was this idea in the world of cradle to grave care by government. Now, obviously, Sweden's moved a bit away from that now, but there are still places in the Western world where we consider taking care of one another or making sure basic needs are met is a good thing and is built in. And so, having all those early life experiences and then kind of seeing my mom go through that age, I realized that so many things on my list of things I wanted to do and was in a rush for, and where it sounded like I was going from accomplishment to accomplishment, was this bucket list I kept refining probably as an undergraduate, but even before I was choosing universities, and wanted to go through and do all of these different things. And when I got to age 34, it was like, wait, what's left? And I didn't realize that it was like I hadn't planned for past 34. I had to get everything done by then. And even though I was conscious that there was this age that I could come to, I was sort of left with, well, what is there left to do? And I thought, well, get married, have a family. And that wasn't straightforward. I suppose the getting married of it all sort of was, but I married someone not from my country, an English person, and there were, there was a time where we decided to move to England, and so there was just the cultural differences that there are that I love and embrace, but aren't again, straightforward because the communication styles are so different, and we don't really talk about that very much. I think people talk a lot about British humor, but when it came to sort of, when we first moved, while we were waiting for our house to be ready, having things like my mother-in-law be very involved in my care at the local surgery, because her reputation and everything was so then it started making me very self-conscious of myself. Anyway, so those became kind of defining experiences. And through that all, I did not end up becoming a mom. And that was very difficult to deal with. So in a way, all of that accomplishing and getting things done by a certain age and having this bucket list of experiences, which I knew I wanted to be international. I knew I wanted to have a lot of life experiences outside the United States. I think is a policy wonk. Our family kind of follow politics quite closely, or did, growing up. I think, I had a real sense that the Iraq War was not right, in my opinion. I think many in the UK would agree with that. And it's really less about agreement, but more about what you see as the fallout now. You think about all of these cause and effect items, and sort of where we are with Syria and the people left behind, and even people like Shamima Begum, who don't have a country, and she's not the only one. And this idea of what you're born with versus what you're not born with, like citizenship that we take for granted. So I know I'm going very wide here, but I guess the through line is sort of interest in lots of different things, structures of power, because I didn't feel like I had power as a child. I had, a very nice middle class upbringing, but again, with my mom going through different corporate layoffs and things, at some point after I actually went off to college a couple years after, she went back to college to finish her degree because she just hit a wall she kept getting laid off. And so she's like, well, I'm just going to go back to school. And it was a difficult thing for a lot of reasons to do that. But, we're very practical, I think, at the end of the day. So for me, it was, a lot of, like I said, the undergraduate experience of going abroad and knowing that I wanted to do more of that and learn about, I love language, and whether I'm great at learning them or not. I'm good at the first part, at the first stages of a language. And then after that, it becomes more difficult. But that's where the Peace Corps came in and that sort of thing. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. It was sort of like the idea of power and influence, which is something that I study even now, and where that comes from, how you manage it, this sort of cause and effect, the laws of attraction, if you will, which obviously play a huge role in and in marketing. And then, what that would mean for my own sense of security and accomplishment as somebody who's, obviously quite clearly a recovering type A personality.
No, thank you for, and it's interesting, you an Englishman, so my wife's from Australia, and we have had much of the same. I think one of the things my wife struggled when she moved over here was that in Australia, it's very common at sort of 6 p.m. at night just to grab a bottle of wine from the fridge and just wander over to it, just go for dinner. You're not invited, you're not expected. You just knock on the door, you turn up.
Yeah.
There's always enough.
So
whereas here, she couldn't get over the thing where people said, "You've got to be." Well, no, we'll ring them and ask them to come in 3 or 4 weeks' time. What do we want to bring? What's the dress code?
Exactly.
Except who else is going to be there? And she said, "Well, we can't just. People can't just turn up." My God, if somebody and we made the mistake once of when I visited my parents. We went out for a walk. We walked past one of my parents' best friend's house, and he said, "Oh, isn't that where I can't remember the name? Jack and Jill live." So yeah, should we just pop in? So I guess my better judgment, I sort of knocked on the door and said, "Oh, hi, we just up from London for the weekend. Walked past, thought we'd say hi." Oh my goodness, you thought we'd come to pillage and burn their house to the ground. We sat there, we weren't offered a cup of tea or anything. We just weren't asked to take our coats off, and it was just things that I felt so awkward. And it is that, even though we speak the same language, a lot of people in Australia, Justine's grandparents are for goodness sake. There is that big. We all talk about cultural difference. I think people think of it as being from the difference between America and China, or the UK and Russia, that difference, or Africa, or whatever. But actually, Australia, England, America, we speak the same language, but we have a different understanding. I think is the
Protocol,
kindest way of putting
I
it.
think, is kind of,
Yeah.
sort of what we're not thinking about. Systems work so differently.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the biggest shock of all of that was when I had actually moved to Northumberland, and we were living in a big house that was on the estate of a castle. So it was on the land of Featherston Castle.
Mhm.
And now I had met the person who owned it and bought the title to it. So I was kind of told the background by everyone in the community of, as the local character, I had to be, because to fit in, I had to be the Californian. And so people had told me stories about this person that made me feel less guarded around them in a way. And I've obviously seen them kind of inebriated, which was, I guess they get loose-lipped, and you sort of see, their passions for various things come out.
Yeah.
But my then husband had been invited to a cricket match on the grounds of the estate. And we were, I brought up our plans for the weekend. That was something he was doing, and I assumed that I would be going and sort of cheering him on. And he's like, well, we don't know because you haven't received an invitation. And I'm thinking, well, my husband's playing in a game. It's a game. It happens to be there. And he's like, no, he apparently sends round a car with a paper invitation. And so I did. I was presented with a paper invitation. I happened to be home to receive on this beautiful, I mean, it looked like something from the coronation. I mean, it was beautifully designed. And yet the house was sort of falling apart. This person had purchased their title. And so this whole idea of this anarchistic, system and what it meant, again, in that study of influence became very interesting to me. I was so interested, for example, to talk later. I'd met at the local hotel, there was a young man who, the innkeeper's son, who had come to town, on break from uni, and he was telling me about having catered an event there and how in the back everything was 70s, falling apart, so ugly, paint peeling. As a lot of us know from those inherited titles, but this person hadn't inherited the title, so you're thinking this might be new money or something like that. Anyway, it was just an odd juxtaposition, but I always love hearing those on the ground stories, and I gravitate towards the people that are, actually looking at things maybe a little differently. And that was, something that he was thinking about, and going back to uni and going to uni in Manchester as opposed to going in London or someplace. So that was, those are the things I loved, but I feel like I have a better understanding now. I actually feel like one of the ways I really felt I understood Englishness was by understanding the humor of certain programs. So for me, Alan Partridge was the big one. And Watership Alan, that episode where the cow falls from the overpass when he's going through the Norfolk Broads on a boat, because he's angered the local farmers. I mean, I laughed so hard, my drink went up my nose. It was like this whole production because I was laughing so hard. And I still smile and sometimes laugh watching it by myself, thinking about my reaction to that once I felt like I got it completely. And then you see people like Noel Edmonds and other people that used to be on TV a lot more, or in the media more. It just adds layers and layers to it. I mean, even Chris Evans to a certain extent, and, the Big Breakfast, TFI Fridays, and all those types of things, adding into this idea of this kind of personality and how he responds to things. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does. And having, and I said before, having spent some time in the US, it does feel that those sort of programs, those sort of characters could only exist in the UK. I don't just think there's an equivalent in the US, but we do have, and the thing is, everybody will know somebody like that to a greater or lesser extent. And I do think in the UK we're getting slightly closer to the American distinction, which tends to be wealthy or poor. If you've got money, you don't have money. We have that. You still have the sort of upper class, working class. Even though people say, "Oh, there's no class system here," there's not official class system, but there is still
there's a
that
lot
slight
more that you can
doffing
point
of the
to.
cap kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more. It's certainly a lot better than it was, and it's certainly not, the colonization of other countries, thankfully, and there's a
Yeah.
Commonwealth that you can opt to be part of. So that's, a step in the right direction, of course. But I think, in terms of people having autonomy to own their own things and stuff, like the coroner
Yeah.
crown, you think about that and you're like, why is that real? I mean, it's not my debate to have. I am not English, British. I have no role in this. But there are things you start thinking about where you're like, is that something that should be given back to India? I remember watching one of the series of Bake Off, and Ruby, the baker, was on, and she was doing a design, inspired by that crown. And it like kind of hit me. Is that something that, like, how, I wonder how people actually feel about that. And so, yeah, there are these archaic systems, but we have archaic systems that are built in from slavery and other sort of negative things. I mean, so I think we have to all kind of be aware that there's probably an equal amount of negative and positive. We just, call them different things and deal with them in different ways. But there's always room for improvement, is, I guess, my feeling. It's difficult at this time because obviously the Epstein files are coming out, and I think there are very specific views about is the monarchy fit for purpose? And, it's been interesting. I guess at a base level, having been a journalist that really went into journalism thinking must uncover the truth, because I saw so much of one truth as a child with my mom going through jobs and struggling, because she didn't remarry, and it would have been a lot easier if she had. And then, juxtaposing that with like the coverage I saw on television, which never matched. The jobs report in the U.S. That the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out, for example, that the stock market puts a lot of effort into, and was a big part of, I was the first digital strategist at Fiverr. And so there were a lot of briefings about the U.S. economy and economies around the world, especially the English-speaking world, that we looked at. And I remember thinking, gosh, is this really reflective? Like, especially, kind of owning the lane of gig economy. That didn't really exist in England like it does now, that's been nice to see. But at the same time, how sustainable that is, even in the US, with this idea of haves and have-nots. It's one thing for Prince Andrew to sort of have a gig available to him of being a trade envoy, but forwarding on, sensitive, potentially State Secrets Act materials, when does that become, because for me, it's like sort of, when does it become treason? It's like, obviously it needs to be investigated, but the investigation hasn't happened. And so every day watching British news, it's sort of like, it feels closer than ever to an investigation. It's like, maybe find out what's fact from fiction, because obviously these emails are out and they don't look good, but needs to be investigated, innocent until proven guilty. And then there's the whole, sexual exploitation of it all, which I think, obviously are two different things. But if Mandelson is going to be held to one standards in such a high profile way as a lord, or, former lord now, why shouldn't Andrew Mountbatten Windsor? Like the juxtaposition is just so clear. So I think that's illustrative. I think, where Americans want to say, oh, look, but what I like to take from that is the reporting behind that. I think the fact that journalists in the UK, news directors and editors, are still running with the story, which is ultimately what forces systems to change in so many ways. I think that should be lauded. And, there's a lot of journalists in the US I'm very disappointed in that aren't covering it enough, aren't going into the detail. We have, things like the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos is, appearing to gut that wonderful, wonderful organization. Watching an interview with Katie Couric and Kara Swisher, two women that I love in the media, have a discussion about it, completely gutted by the loss. One having grown up reading it, living in the DC metro area with Katie Couric, and Kara Swisher starting out there. It's really unfathomable for someone with such huge wealth to not just kind of allow this to continue. And also the missed opportunities, particularly in podcasting. They had one podcast, The Daily. And, when Ezra Klein left, they never sort of cultivated that personality again, which there were just a lot of things from a brand perspective, a marketing perspective. You're going, that was potentially a huge cash cow. Even just the sporting stuff, if they had taken all the sports coverage, yet they've just cut all of that.
Yeah, completely.
And so you go, and then you go, so are the Epstein file, like, do we have journalists that are being paid, compensated properly to look through these emails? And even, like, I haven't heard very much about how many duplicates are there. Early on, there were a lot of duplicates in the dumps. And when I would go on just to kind of have a look and search for names, there were tons and tons of duplicates. And now you're kind of hearing less about that and more about this 3 million number. Well, what is that? 3 million pieces of paper, 3 million different reports? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I think there's not the systems that we need to kind of hold the powerful to account are not working. And partly that's because legacy systems have become part of the establishment, I think. And they're just not trusted like they used to.
Well, I think we saw it very clearly at the inauguration, and I think, never mind legacy platforms, but the new platforms. So Jeff Bezos and his and Lauren and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and everybody, they were literally within arm's reach of the president. And it's very clear. You look at Jeff Bezos funding the Melania documentary to the tune of $1 billion, including marketing, because they want the contracts for his space entity.
Yeah.
So so they're doing everything close to the president. So it's not about, then in their heart of hearts, I'm sure Jeff Bezos has a different view. I think 3 years ago, he had a very different view of things. And so did Mark Zuckerberg. But now they've realized that actually we need to keep in with this individual who is on a whim can change this so quickly. And that's where they've decided to invest their time. I'm sure when the Democrats come back into power, they'll swing the other way. But for now, they're doing it purely from a commercial perspective, which is just sad in a way.
Yeah, but it's also, Bezos, I think, had opportunities with the Post to actually help revive and innovate on, journalistic platforms, because he had the money, which is really peanuts to him. And I know lots of people are saying that. I'm not one that says it's okay to sort of theoretically spend other people's money. But I do think he could have made it profitable. I think he could have showed or created a model for the news business to be profitable. But if he wants to live his private life, I mean, obviously he wasn't in charge of the paper to begin with, but the leaders he did put in charge, you could make really strong arguments that none of them were particularly well suited for success or set up to succeed in the role. So that's where the problems sort of come. If you're, good leaders are kind of known for how well they can appoint leaders and run teams and that sort of thing. And I think, priorities in his life changed, which was fine. But the sort of tech bro culture, which I was very enmeshed in the early to mid 2000s in my career, and, interviewing people on the A-list, I interviewed Kara Swisher and all of these other tech folks, a lot of whom had really successful exits from companies and are now just investing for a living. I have, and actually having worked with Elon Musk myself, I feel like there's certain personality types that have actually reasons that their personalities are the way that they are. If we're going to look at it empathetically, Elon Musk's, admitted that he has Asperger's, that he, knowing him a bit personally, I know that he has issues relating to people. You can see other people like Mark Zuckerberg. I remember when he was coming up, his sister Randy was headed marketing at Facebook for the longest time. It's funny because she actually just followed me on Substack like last week, I think it was, or the week before. And I was so excited because we hadn't been in touch in so long. So it was a good excuse. But she was in charge. And I think, that said a lot to me. I remember at that time with just tangentially being in the room with Mark Zuckerberg and feeling he felt awkward or the need to be cool. And I think, having his sister in that role taught me a lot about what his personality might be like in terms of temperament. And so kind of fast forwarding where they are, this elite set of men, notably, are able to kind of set the tone for so much of how we look at things, from a functional human being kind of perspective, how businesses should run is very problematic, because you have people like Laureen Powell Jobs Kara Swisher pointed this out in the interview I was talking about with Katie Couric. You know, Steve Jobs' widow has a media empire of her own that she's self-funding, and apparently it's not completely a loss. It's not something she's just losing money on. So I think there, you know, there are models out there, but I do think that there is this sort of toxic masculinity piece to it all that really concerns me, because these are the same people that are allowing the amplification of voices of people like Andrew Tate and his brother.
Yeah.
You know, we've had some really high profile trials in the United States where you go, someone like Brian Koberger and the Idaho 4 case. I hate calling it the Idaho 4, but the death of the 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho. And you look at someone like Brian Koberger and go, before the internet, or maybe before the smartphone, would this person have existed? Did he need a community online to kind of allow an escalation of okaying his sense of entitlement to view and do certain things when it comes to what appears to be his relationship with the opposite sex, and, you know, just his ability to maybe even mature as a human being generally. And I think we're having more of that debate, obviously, in Australia and the UK, where, you know, there are actual efforts to bring in limits. In the US, we have this landmark lawsuit going on with a Jane Doe suing Meta for you know, their child's death, and you know, and you know, discussions around privacy and everything. But I think that the most illustrative, you know, kind of issue around this is Prince Harry made a statement to support those families, and I think he was at the first day of court because the case is taking place in Los Angeles. He was physically somewhere to show support. On the very same week that his wife on Instagram released the most full-face photo we've seen yet of young Lilibet, their daughter. So you're kind of going, okay, they have the control, but are they saying that that platform is okay? I get that, you know, they should be completely entitled to make whatever money they want to. And obviously, I don't have a British viewpoint on this necessarily, except that I've, you know, heard the kind of legacy thoughts around it maybe a bit more. But I do think that these juxtapositions is what we need to look deeper into instead of deflecting from. And I feel like there's a lot of deflection and a lot of self-reflection that just doesn't happen. People are still just sticking iPads in front of their children. Why? Well, I mean, is it any coincidence that we seem to have a huge issue with childcare? That women are still paid less than men, and usually are the ones that are working through these caregiving issues. I mean, even in my situation, a friend of mine, you know, sort of was saying, as I was kind of making the decision to live where I live at the moment, was saying, oh, I just tell my wife, you outsource all that. Just outsource all that. And I'm going, my brother has schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. How do you outsource care for that? Because his brain works differently, and I have an interest in that. No one else, except maybe some in our immediate family, are ever going to care to the point where he can live a happy life. Because it shouldn't just be that he's living and he's, you know, maybe even thriving, but the fact, I want him to be happy. I want him to have self-actualization, if that's, to the extent that that's possible. And, you know, we worked together over the pandemic, everything went online, and he was able to finish his degree from UC Santa Cruz. So, I mean, I feel like you know, we have these touchstone moments, and that can open up other issues, because, you know, now he's feeling like, well, should I be doing something with my degree? My brain doesn't work in a way that makes it easy to keep a job, and you know, medications and different things that make me feel like I'm on a seesaw as far as feeling good, feeling bad, feeling clear enough, and this idea of being good enough. And so, how, you know, even just being there to say, you exist, therefore I love you. You're enough for me. I think, you know, sometimes you just have to kind of be there. Someone needs to be there to say those things, and to say outsource it. Again, I think I said to you before we started recording, it pains me to see how poorly caregivers are treated in both of our countries, you know, because it not only what it says about the caregiver, but more about what it says about the people being cared for. And although I know there's a lot of debate about, you know, Kate Garraway and her bringing her husband's long COVID battle to light, I actually think it did bring a discussion to the fore, even if it goes away and it doesn't get circled back to. It did bring an important discussion to the forefront, whatever the context, about the need for caregiving and how transactional it can be. And if you choose that path to do yourself, it is so costly. There are only so many clients I can take right now, for example. And client work is, university is wonderful and I love it and they're so supportive and it's a great place. And I can't say enough good things about UC San Diego. But at the same time, it's not the kind of pay you make in consulting work. And it's not even maybe as secure as it used to be maybe 15, 20 years ago. So you have to kind of keep competing to get your enrollment to a certain point, for example, to stay in a role. It's not a given that you're going to have that role. It's a year-to-year agreement and, they can use you or not use you. And I've been very, very, very fortunate to be able to stay in that role for so many years now, and across different departments. But, at the same time, like I said, I remember when I was working with Fiverr, again, because it was in that early startup phase. And so, and they had allowed a provision in my contract so that I could continue with the consulting work that I had or even seek more consulting work. So I had a long-term client that, was very successful, but was kind of a bit high maintenance that I was working with. And then, other inquiries would come in and I was going, oh, do I do an agency model or how do I model this out to basically, make the most money while also offering the most consistent service. And, I didn't feel like I had a mentor. I didn't feel like I had a model. It was really, really difficult. And at the end of the day, I left Fiverr within a year, mostly because I wasn't sleeping. I couldn't get enough sleep. I remember we had a really successful in-person event, our first in-person event in New York City. And, it exceeded all expectations. And I went to the postmortem the next day, as we call it, reviewing how things went. And I'm really used to those. In the media, we have those. And I had come from some brutal newsrooms where we'd gone over and I'd been yelled at and, rightfully so in some cases and maybe not so rightfully so in others. I'd yelled at people before. So we're going through the list of what we could have done better, what to do better for next time, kind of, the sequence of events. And there were a couple of things where, I was lightly, it wasn't even really, I think, a criticism of me. It was my team. And I started crying and I couldn't stop crying. I went off to a separate room and it was this WeWork. It was in this big Midtown Manhattan shared office space. And it was so embarrassing because I don't cry in front of people, especially not my employer. And it just got to be too much at some point. But it was hard to know that. It was really hard to know that. And I felt like that was recognizing that and actually taking action to remove myself, for example, from our Skype group, which was like a Slack today, was so notable and such a big deal. I think that looking back now, I see it as one of the bravest and best things I did because I needed to leave or something had to give. I would have had to arrange, maybe I would have stayed there and gotten rid of the client. Maybe I would have arranged it slightly differently, but I don't regret what I did because I actually did what I needed to do for me. And sometimes people say, failure is the best way to learn. And I think that can be true, but it also can be failure or something you saw as failure at that moment. And then later in your life, you're going, no, you couldn't have survived. I was managing people in 7 different time zones. And so it just became impossible. And I didn't have words for that. And, in corporate America, as you know, there's not an easy way. When you're working for a startup in Series B funding or Series C funding, you're not going to have those breaks. You're not going to, you're going to live a different kind of lifestyle.
So are you still working on the book Generationisms?
Yes. Yeah, I've been working on it for actually a long time. So
tell me a little bit about, because I have I've always vacillated between believing there are fundamental differences between Gen Alpha, Gen Z, Boomers, Gen X, etc., and thinking Gen Z just aren't as old as we are yet. They'll become us. But do you believe there are fundamental differences in the different generations and how they approach life?
I do, but they're formed by their life experiences. So I think
okay, yeah,
what most people will say, historians, anthropologists, people in sociology, and lots of different academic areas might agree that there are sort of, at least from my standpoint, breaking it into very simple terms, pop culture moments, something that breaks through, that kind of unifies society. 9/11 was a big one for me. That was my first, while I was working in news, my first huge news story, and going out to New York when I was able to fly. The reaction of my family before that even happened, because I was working in San Francisco for ABC at that time, and my sister in particular, who's not in touch so much about the kind of day-to-day, whereas my mom, we usually talk most days. But I remember her phoning so many times and leaving messages on my machine. Back in the day, we had those. But she would leave answer phone messages, because she was, oh my God, I just saw this on Good Morning America. And, they're saying the Golden Gate Bridge, they're saying the Oakland Bay Bridge, so there were different theories and rumors being circulated on even the mainstream television networks at that time. And, remembering my family's concern, I worked with someone directly who had a friend whose father passed away. And then fast forward 5 years later, I was back in journalism. I was back in New York, but in journalism school this time. So I had decided to go back because I wanted the ability. I remember I had an instructor when I was an undergraduate who had said, Jennifer, just keep in the back of your mind, even if you don't want to do a master's in journalism now, maybe think about it so it gives you the option to teach. Because you may not want to teach now, that may not even be in, and it wasn't. It was like I was off doing a million things that I wanted to accomplish. But I remembered he said that, and so I'd kind of come to this lull in my career where I had a boss that said, yeah, sure, you can, go seek other work, because I'd sort of hit the glass ceiling where I was, and there wasn't really much else I felt like I could attain in my job. And for some reason, that wasn't okay to me. I could have just stayed at that job for 20 years and been fine. But at the same time, I just felt this real yearning, like I needed to do something. So I ended up going to journalism school, and in the 5-year anniversary of 9/11, going down and doing stories on that anniversary, and the place in the psyche that occupies for people is profound because of what what so many people physically saw that day, which was really horrific, even though we had it playing on tape. So that's sort of my generational example, and I feel like everybody kind of has one of those. What's interesting in millennials and Gen Z, which I think, particularly came up when I was doing my podcast in the mid 2000s, in 2009 or so. I had done some political activism on campus at UC Berkeley when I was younger, and I had met some really interesting people, and one of whom had co-written a book called Millennial Makeover, and it was about, appealing to the millennials, and this was this whole new generation that we were kind of excited to meet. I mean, I remember feeling excited to kind of have this new cohort of people and fresh ideas. Those are the things I like to lean into. And so there's that book, and I remember thinking, that positive thinking around a new generation coming up. And then fast forwarding to now, and the online dialogue, which is the dialogue between sort of Gen Z and then these sort of movements that have come up online, like OK Boomer, the Karen thing, where Gen Z, Boomers, whomever, like older generations older than that generation, are very critical in a way that I don't remember my generation, which is a very small generation anyway, but I don't remember my generation being. I remember impatience around war stories and our greatest generation, our World War II veterans, maybe. And, that might be annoying. It might depend on if you come from a family where someone served in the military. My grandfather did. So that was a real point of pride. He was drafted as a young 17-year-old. So, but also was from an immigrant family. So I think that sort of plays into that meant he really graduated into being an American, and it meant something very specific. And I think you had more of those stories of the pride of immigration and being successful as an immigrant. And you look now and it's sort of the opposite. So if you think about it, each of these generations has a very different worldview. And when you are in marketing, the number one thing is to know your target audience, know your target market. And so to some extent, I feel like it's a professional responsibility to kind of understand how these generations, where they're coming from, surely. But I think the place I am interested in is how they then relate to one another. Because then you have things that are, sort of phenomena within generations, like, how did millennials respond generally to helicopter parenting, and how did that affect their parenting? Who was the helicopter parenting done by? Some of it was done by the greatest generation, by boomers. Some of it was done by Gen X. And then what does that mean for millennials as parents to Gen Xers? All of the subsequent relational pieces. But I just think it's very interesting to see how there's intergenerational criticism, a lot of it because of wealth. And we kind of touched on this before about systems and the elites and that sort of thing, and looking at how good boomers had it or didn't. And I'm not sure that that's a useful necessarily, sure, feel what you want to feel, but I'm not sure that that's super useful in kind of being successful or in changing systems or in life, right? In focusing on the things that are kind of out of our control. My mom and dad bought their first house in San Jose, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, for I think $19,000 in the 70s. Today. And my mom had, they rented that house, so they kept that house, bought another house. Now with my father's death, my mom had to sell those properties. So she looks back and she goes, God, those are like multi-million-dollar homes. And I live a very modest life now. What could I, what a stupid decision that was. But I always say that to her, and I would say to anyone, these are all moments for us to kind of reflect on and realize that we're only human. It proves that we're only human. And the thing is, she has children that want to spend time with her. She's not lonely. And would you trade that for potentially a house that's worth millions and millions of dollars? There are these trades that people make all of the time. A lot of the sacrifice she made to be home with us meant that she knows us and could relate to us, and therefore we choose to spend time with her as adults. Whereas if she had worked more to keep those homes, then maybe she wouldn't. But in any event, that's where the idea for generations came from, was partially this idea of politicians having created a book called Millennial Makeover that looked at appealing to millennials and what was going to need to happen. And you look now, I think if you use the political example again, the fractious nature of how people feel about politics generally, where trust resides, whether we feel like politics is a noble profession anymore, or noble pursuit. I had my own experience where I was selected to do this program called Emerge for women leaders. And I did it, and it's like a 6-month program and quite a time commitment, and it's supposed to be a huge honor to be part of it. But I remember going to the Democratic Convention in California that year, and just for various reasons feeling like they're just as bad as the other side, just different. Because and part of that came from just the place of, living in a more modest environment with my mom and being around people with more humble salaries and feeling like, yeah, I can sit in this sort of global elite circle because of my Ivy League education and all of that. But I know the lived experiences of real people, and this mismatch of lecturing people or assuming what they need leads to all kinds of wasted time and effort that's very upsetting. And at the same time, the Forward Party, which is Andrew Chang's party, which was around, he had lobbied on universal basic income and some other kind of really interesting ideas that we haven't completely explored. But the only full UBI study that I've seen was done in Stockton, California. So, these things there's precedent for them taking place, and like going through the process, they're still going through the process, that party, of trying to even be seen on a ballot.
Yeah.
Once I got stuck in and learned about all those things, it's a full-time gig, and a lot of it is just around sucking up to people for money. And does it make sense to use your corporate connections to go and get a huge check from one or two places who are going to want something back, of course, but hopefully you're able to manage that within reason? Or do you get all these micro donations? I mean, ideally you do both, but the amount of time it takes to door knock, et cetera, and to feel like you might become part of a system that can't change anyway, that was a frustrating thought for me. And really the bottom line came down to it is the place that I'm, residing at the moment is quite red compared to the rest of California. So conservative, and a lot of Trump voters. And there are Proud Boys here. And ironically, there is, you still with me?
Yeah, still here.
Good, your screen went black for a second. But there is this sort of, I feel it's an issue when women are running for office and you're preparing them, safety should be one of the natural things. We've never had more femicide and abuse towards women and girls than ever. And most governments in the English-speaking world are really acknowledging that and trying to do something about it and flipping the script. The woman in France who was so badly so many crimes were committed against her sexually in France, has a book out. There's so much we can learn from her about, flipping the script on shame, making, men a proactive part, and I think it's important for men to feel they're part of this, because this is not a pile-on men. It's about protection of women. Those are two separate things. And in any event, I, at the end of the day, feel like, we can all be kind of doing better and working together generationally without kind of assigning blame. But I do think that a lot of it comes from what social media platforms inspire and choose to proliferate, whether or not they want to take ownership of that.
It's fascinating, and I totally agree with what you said. And I think, particularly for Gen Z, I think there is that. They're probably the first generation where it's going to be very difficult to buy a property without parental help or inheritance or whatever. Whereas when I was born in 1969, so Gen X, I think it is. So it was a bit of a struggle. It was hard to save up, et cetera, but managed to buy a house. For my children, they're going to be able to buy a house because we'll leave them money and my parents will leave them money, or my in-laws will leave them money. But whereas now I think London, I think the average property is 11 times the average salary, whereas it used to be 3 or 4 times. Because property was always somewhere to live. It wasn't an asset until the 80s, really. My parents bought a house, I think 70s, 80s, went up by inflation pretty much each year. Didn't do this, but suddenly in the 80s, it was, oh gosh, property. And normal people started buying property, buying rental property, all that sort of thing, and it became an asset class that's somewhere to live, and that's one. So I think that, with their blame for what they believe we did or are doing to the environment, that's another challenge that they have, I think. But it does feel that social media exacerbates that, drags people into an echo chamber. You find other people that the social media is wonderful. So if I have a particular passion or particular interest or want to be part of a particular group, then I can find somebody else like me on the internet. It's wonderful, but it can also exacerbate your negative or darkest trait and find other people that support those, and you end up in an echo chamber. You end up potentially doing terrible things because you think, well, actually, gosh, other people out there like that. They're encouraging me. They're saying it's a good thing, and you end up with these very dark places people get dragged into. And I did want to come on to something you created around trust and the trust framework, and just almost to layer onto that, what impact you think our increased use of, or our increased connection with AI will have. Because every time I go online, read something, there's always something about AI. I used to be in commercial real estate. Stocks of commercial real estate went down by 20% in 2 days last week because everybody's terrified of AI. So what is trust in the age of AI? That's a big question.
I think trust is being, in a way, with the idea of the book around generationisms, where we come to in looking at trust is one of the key factors that I'm looking at. And the trust framework, just for context, was built for my influencer marketing course at UC San Diego. So I do trainings and corporate work around this idea of trust and narratives that are true, but allow people to look at their product, their service, whatever it is they're doing, and to make trust really the centerpiece of that, because that is the ultimate amongst all the generations. It's the ultimate currency in a way, but something that a lot of, whether it's a company or individual, doesn't look at until it's gone. So we see this a lot in parasocial relationships, kind of what I think of as the cornerstone of the internet. Even when we had, what was it, BBS? I remember my aunt did that. This is my aunt on my dad's side. My mom is, Portuguese family, culturally, and, because her grandparents were immigrants and my great-grandparents. So it's a while away for me, but there's still that, immigrant spirit of working hard and, doing well and, trying to kind of fit in with the American dream sort of thing. On my dad's side of the family, very different. But interestingly, my mother went to high school with my aunt, and my aunt became obsessed with Portuguese people. So anyway, it's weird. I have a cousin on that side that lives in Portugal because her mother ended up setting her up from these forums online. So that was, that phenomena is interesting even in that way, because I do feel like while there were a lot of online relationships, there was a lot of negativity around it. It's sort of like when online dating started, even before apps, there was a lot of negative feeling about that. But people that were doing it were going, well, what other choice do I have, right? It's not like there's, culturally, some people still have, some matchmaking and things that happen, but it's not all that common. So how do you then move on? How do you find your people, right? And that becomes difficult. And I feel like even more so now, because if you think about YouTubers and other people in our worlds, influencers on Instagram, whomever, we have this sort of set of people that we come to trust, and you can see the relationship that forms with these people that's obviously very one-sided. And it always starts to concern me. And for a couple of reasons, not just that it's obviously not a very winning emotional exchange for most people on the attached side of it, because they're not, they're really just buying products to feel like they're in with this person, or giving donations that maybe aren't as needed as portrayed. They're maybe not as a lot of the people aren't as skeptical in earlier generations of intention, which, my mom and I talk about this all the time because I get concerned for her, and she's a very skeptical person, I think, by nature, in a healthy way. So I think it's, I don't get concerned about it, but it is something that I sort of want to check in with everyone about, my brother as well. And so you have that. And so that phenomena has sort of, every generation is kind of looking at it a little bit differently, but trusting individuals, sometimes based just on those parasocial relationships, and those are the mainstay of their lives. And the trust framework was built for the influencer marketing course to give all of us, no matter where we came from in our lives, because I teach people that some are undergraduates, some have graduated or are deciding on graduate school, they want to do a certificate. Some, are just taking the class because they might have seen me speak somewhere and they want to kind of learn, what is the ROI of influencer marketing? How is it that it's as common now as email marketing, or as much a part of strategy as email marketing? How does that work? And you really do need to vet people. You need to go through a series of check boxes to kind of ground yourself. And every generation sees that differently. So going back to the people that I teach, I have a lot of professionals that are retraining through the San Diego Workforce Partnership. So they might be able to take the class for a discounted rate or for free. And then there are other just, professionals that maybe did some international learning from UC San Diego, who's got, an amazing international footprint. So I get executives from, Dahmer, Chrysler, is that BMW, whatever BMW's parent company is. I'll get people from, these huge multinationals. Pharma come through a lot, biotech, because, San Diego is very associated with that. So they end up finding our program through search in that way. So the trust framework is absolutely essential, because otherwise you're not on the same page about what trust even is and how it flows through. A lot of the vetting checklists that go along with that I've created, because you need some way to vet influencers, especially for small, medium-sized businesses that can't maybe afford a platform or just purchase a platform for a period of time and expect it to be able to vet everything, when my real life experience tells me that those are not foolproof. I might be working with a company that is serving people going through fertility challenges, for example, and you choose an influencer, and you think they're perfect for the role, and they're brought to you by, an esteemed partner or company that you work with in some way. And, you just do the lightest set of vetting. One of my first stops might be OnlyFans, for example. And I'll probably just do a data script. So I'll see that in the data script, but, just looking at their presence everywhere. Where is their name claimed? And at that first stage, I found in one case there was an OnlyFans account, which isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but you do need to kind of figure out what it was that they were selling. And in this particular case, it just was a no-brainer that it did not work for the brand. Selling pregnancy fetish photos is probably not going to work for a hopeful, a company hoping to be multinational that is, selling, IVF cycles.
You just don't want, as a company, you just don't want any surprises, do you? So you hire an influencer and you work with them. You don't want something to come out, the media to find something you didn't already know. But if you knew about something and made the decision to go ahead anyway, then more fool you. But if you're surprised by something, that's not good.
But so many marketers are sort of in the cowboy wild west of influencer marketing, right? And so, for Gen Z, they kind of take for granted maybe some of the checks that they're doing, because they're, native to all of this. Their life has always been app-based. They're the first generation where, an iPad was stuck in front of them to be their babysitter, rightly or wrongly. And so as digital natives in that way, I think, they probably factor trust in very differently and think about it differently, and also structure the importance of those parasocial and other relationships to their own attachment style and what they feel they need. Some of them are opting out, which is really interesting to go. I think this was a really interesting phenomena that was covered around the time Celebrity Traders came out, where, I remember on This Morning, Ben Shepherd and Kat Deely were talking about, how young people were saying, oh, isn't this cool? It comes on at a certain time and we all get together and we watch it on telly.
Yeah. Water
and it was
TV.
like, yeah, we used to do that way back in the day. Not that it matters, but it is interesting that they seem to notice and talked widely about the difference of sitting down together, experiencing something together, hearing reaction together, at a time when we have more theaters closing than ever. Not in the sort of West End sense, but in terms of movie theaters. And the whole idea there was the shared experience of hearing each other gasp or laugh or whatever. And that doesn't seem to be translating as much. But maybe, when we have these sort of pop culture phenomena moments, and maybe it's, I'm waiting to see if that sort of thing happens in the United States as a much larger country with lots of different people from different places that don't feel very unified. Even within a state like California that's so large, you don't really feel that. But in Britain, at least, it seemed like there was this massive kind of coming together. And so I just hold out hope that something like that will happen, so that at least generationally there will be that a contrasting experience for people, and they may be able to be more intentional in decision making around the way they form relationships.
And it's one of those things, like so many things, we never knew we needed or wanted to be able to binge a television show. I remember watching Dallas and waiting for the next week to find out who shot JR, and the week after, waiting, watching whatever the oh gosh, it's Thursday night, that means Seinfeld's going to be on, or it's Monday, it's going to be on Partridge. I'll wait for that episode. We'll go to school the next day. We'll do the impressions of them the next day because we've all seen it at the same time.
Yeah.
And then suddenly we were given this ability to be able to watch all 8 episodes of a program on the night it was released. Even Stranger Things, they released it in 2 batches. So some before Christmas, some at Christmas, but 4 episodes at a time. And it's odd that so many things that we're given, we never actually asked for. It's yeah, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I was just thinking about influence. I think probably the first influencer marketers that I could think of were probably televangelists. That's what they did basically, was influencer marketing. Weren't they? And so many of them, it seemed, transpired, turned out to have private jets and 1 or 2 mistresses or 1 or 2 boyfriends or some financial peculiarities, whatever. But that was a thing. So our parents, they were sending money off to the local televangelists, and that was it. It's so it goes through generations. Whereas, but now, I think one of the issues now, and it's hard because in the UK, for people in America listening, there's a guy called Martin Lewis. He's called the money saving expert,
and he sold his brand. So money saving expert is not owned by him anymore. So I think that does play a role. Remember when that was sold? That was a huge deal.
It was, but he still has a saying what they do, and he's always said he'd never ever put his nor face to any financial product ever. But if you go into Facebook, Instagram, whatever, there are always cryptocurrencies or insurance things that Martin Lewis recommends, and he says he employs somebody just to try and get them taken down. But by the time he gets them taken down, another one comes up, and somebody's bought into it. But your name's there. How can they use your name with that? And people see you marketing something, me marketing, Martin Lewis marketing something, believe because it's there, they must have somehow approved. Otherwise, it wouldn't be allowed, would it? But
so those because fake ads using people's name and reputation. So
which is I don't know how you overcome it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had, an experience firsthand where I was the person in charge of managing that. And we created a page on our website. It was a high profile male doctor. And where it really escalated, there were all kinds of scams people were using in his name. And, we could put those on the website and hopefully it would show up high in search so that people might become aware of it. It just became so insidious in Facebook Messenger and some other places when we found out after, unfortunately, people's money had been taken, that people were using his face, his pictures, changing his pictures to say that he had a son in distress, for example, and he needed money wired to him, and he doesn't even have a son. I mean, so people are photoshopping in a child that doesn't exist and making up stories. I mean, obviously, I think most people now would be hip to a doctor you don't know reaching out to you and wanting to have a romantic relationship, and within a couple of weeks they want a huge money transfer. So hopefully we're at a more sophisticated place. But you're right, there is a big gap in what people are aware of. And with Martin Lewis, the trust of a money saving expert whose life has, in the public eye at least, has been dedicated to helping people be wiser and save money as, in the consumer financial spaces, to buy homes and mortgages, the most important decisions of their life. As you say, many of these hard won now for generations that are fighting to even be able to achieve home ownership, and to be, taken for a ride and lose any amount of money in this environment is just unacceptable. And what I came up against, and what I think, he's reflected on the times that I've seen him talk about this, and the fact, I think he employs more than one person now actually, is the fact that the social networking sites, Facebook in particular, I find to be the most insidious because it has the messaging component built in. WhatsApp is just a click away and integrated to some extent. So it goes international very quickly at very little to no cost. It's really a time cost for the scammers or bot farms or whatever technology is running these various scams. And Facebook will not do anything proactive to help you preserve your name. And there seems to be very simple things they can do. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed on your side of the pond, but on ours, after the 2025 election, and the timing is a bit questionable whether it was related or not. I tend to think there are probably no coincidences, but Facebook had official fact checkers that came in around the time of COVID misinformation.
Yep.
And, I'm not saying that, we shouldn't question everything and we shouldn't be skeptical of vaccines and things. So I'm not on any particular side in this, but I do think we saw particularly concerning misinformation out there about, for example, microchips being implanted by someone
Bill
getting
Gates,
a virus, the whole Bill Gates conspiracy. So those conspiracies that were, easily explained and shown not to be true by fact checkers on Facebook could be taken down quickly, disabled. And a cornerstone of my career has been free speech. So obviously I am very concerned that we wouldn't want to take things down, but Facebook's always been very conservative in terms of taking things down, but they did have these fact checkers on staff. Well, around the time Donald Trump was inaugurated, those fact checkers went away. And I have seen a demonstrable difference in the content and also how people are relaying content to me. So if they're coming to me for crisis intervention or to help them in a spot of trouble, it really, really is fed. They are fed their worst fears over and over again. And, algorithms and signals play a key part in that. And and there's all kinds of bias in algorithms and signals. So, I have to go over in my digital marketing foundational course, and I always mention this in Influencer as well, is, check your bias. And part of that is making sure you're in a browser environment that doesn't know who you are. Otherwise, it's feeding you your biases. It's feeding you what you want, what it thinks you want to know, with all of these other factors like advertising and commercial interests involved. So I think, we have to kind of be aware and then just take as proactive steps as we can. I mean, I like the film, The Social Dilemma. I'm not sure it showed it that well, but the idea that there's a clone of you out there in the metaverse that Meta is trying to sell to, because if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. And increasingly what I get concerned about and really miffed by is where you're both the product, unless you opt out and are aware that you can, and that's not going to apply in all countries. But in California, we do have some great opt-outs, which is nice to have on cookies, at least. But you're also paying a subscription fee, for example. So you're both paying and the product, and that's a real problem. That should not be allowed, in my opinion.
And even more so with AI. Two things. I mean, AI could literally record 10 seconds of our conversation and make perfect clones of you and I talking and saying whatever, saying anything at all. And that's very hard. And then I think from an AI perspective, again, so in many cases you're paying for AI, you're paying for Claude or for OpenAI or for Grok or whatever. But unless you really, really dig into the terms of conditions, you're also giving them all of your data. And a lot of companies don't realize that they're literally giving all of their corporate data to an AI to utilize in whichever way they see fit. And the terms and conditions are many, many, many pages long, and very few people read them. But unless you actually go in there and really lock everything down, then you can see why companies are terrified about AI. Not only because it becomes a competitive threat, lots of other things, but also it's using your data to learn and feed you back more of what you want to pay for, which is it's extraordinary.
With biases built in. So,
this is it. Absolutely.
You see, the oppression of different people by the content that they're fed. It's insane. We're still repeating these systems. There was a thread last year around October of LinkedIn's algorithm seemingly favoring men that went wide. And Megan Cornish was one of the people I followed for a long time on LinkedIn. She's on Substack. I encourage people to take a look. She wrote wonderfully about the experiences that she had. LinkedIn interviewed her for a series of their own. And basically they're saying, oh, it's our bad, kind of, but we didn't intend it. So it's all about intention. But, if you murdered someone, even if you didn't mean to, it's still manslaughter.
It's
You still
manslaughter,
would go to
absolutely.
prison for it, right? So these are where I think the law has always been slow to catch up to innovation, just the way it is. I mean, if you look at IP over time, intellectual property,
Yeah.
we talk about IP all the time, and sometimes I wonder, do people realize what this is? But anyone who's watched an episode of Shark Tank or Dragon's Den will
No,
know what that
do you know what
is.
it is?
But it's a cornerstone of often businesses, and it's interesting to me that we don't push these debates forward. And I think we're so busy as people, we don't even know where to start. So for me, a lot of it is kind of trying to feel like in the courses that I do teach, that I am hopefully a reminder and filter of the ethics and humanity of it all. In that way, I think the basic products we think of as AI right now are probably not as dangerous as some people are giving voice to, because they make
Yeah.
money giving voice to those things. I would say be as concerned about the terms and conditions on OpenAI, Claude, any of those, and note the difference between a paid and unpaid account in case you decide not to continue with a paid account. And you can actually use AI to review the contract for you. Just use a few
Yes.
of them, and that they can help point out the problem spots even on their own platform. But be as concerned about that as you are about, Ancestry DNA or 23andMe. 23andMe shutting down last year and
I
not knowing what
know.
was going to happen
It
to
was
all of that
terrifying.
DNA, because things change as time moves on and companies can go out of business. Thankfully, it became a nonprofit, and that, fingers crossed, seems to be a good thing. And I've sort of taken a gamble and allowed my DNA to stay there. But I also don't upload it to GEDmatch. So I'm making proactive, I like to think, decisions. And I am downloading those terms and conditions and using AI to hopefully make me work a bit smarter and quicker, more efficiently. And maybe examine things in a little bit more depth too, because of the research engine that you can kind of create and the LLMs that allow you to kind of create these notebooks that are just rich with information that you can reuse and reuse and reuse and continue to refresh with new materials. So for example, for me, I don't have a lot of time to read very long academic papers, but I want to know and be on top of and potentially participate in research and look for research gaps, because you'd be surprised how much academics really are thinking deeply about the influence one person has on another. And, in contrast to the sort of televangelism example that you gave earlier, I would say in my family, there was always huge skepticism about that, and would never
Good.
have given money and not seen those individuals as influencers widely, maybe to the niche audiences that believe in evangelical Christianity. But, I was raised in an environment where religion is private. It's something you do at home. It's nobody's business because it shouldn't affect your business. And I think that was, part of the, my mom's immigrant response to things, and, people coming to a new country and wanting to be respectful. Particularly, I didn't grow up around a lot of Jewish people, for example, or the people that I didn't talk a lot about the holidays and things like that. Then later, working for Israeli companies like Fiverr, I learned a lot about how significant the month of September is, and what those holidays, not only that they're holidays, but how different they are than what my concept of a holiday was before I had these in-depth conversations with individuals I got to know well. So I think, going back to AI, I think one, we have to realize how integrated it is already in our lives. So without Claude, ChatGPT, all the big companies, Meta, Grok, we were using it. I think of the moment that I think of us all kind of unifying around using AI was the recommendation screen on Netflix or whatever your favorite streaming service was during the pandemic. Every age group just about, obviously that could afford it, were, searching for content on streaming services. And that was all AI driven. And I think if you sort of think about if you are, for example, using your phone in your car, if you're in England or most of the United States, you have to be hands-free. I mean, in England, you know, learning to drive there is like a whole other thing. They take driving so seriously, unbelievable. I think it's wonderful, but at the same time, it was very daunting as an American going, I really want to get like my own driver's license, like a British driver's license, but, you know, or English driver's license. But in any event, it's just taken as a responsibility so seriously. But if to do a hands-free setup, you rely on AI. All of that is AI. It may be integrated in your steering wheel in some way, or whatever, but voice commands are artificial intelligence, period. And so I think you kind of have to look backwards and go like, I've already allowed it into my life a lot. Am I concerned about those things? You know, the Super Bowl ad that, you know, brought up questions about Ring insecurity and Amazon owning that company. You know, it was interesting. You talked about, you know, we talked a bit about Jeff Bezos and, you know, had some criticisms there. It's actually something that's made me not prioritize, I think. I hadn't thought about it until we started speaking, but Prince Charles has a documentary out, and I was kind of curious what it was. You know, it was supposed to be more about sort of his background in environmental, you know, environmental causes and things. And I thought that might be really interesting, also just from a perception standpoint and their influence, which I've written about before because of Prince Andrew and when Virginia Roberts Giuffre's book came out last year. And in any event, I hadn't really thought about it, but I don't think I really want to watch it because it's on Prime. And there's a real effort right now by some folks in the media that I respect to use less Amazon or to opt out where possible. And though I haven't done that actively, I can already start to sort of notice my own bias kind of filtering in of going, oh, well, maybe the Washington Post 300 layoffs last week was a step too far for me. Because, you know, the freedom of a strong press is so fundamental to the balance of power in this country and in most civilized societies. So, yeah, I think for me, influencer really, you know, when I am teaching it, really starts around brand mascots. In the United States, Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben are kind of unique examples of that, if you're familiar with those two brands, both of which have sunsetted. So around the pandemic, BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, and kind of looking at race and the stereotypes that we've evolved and allowed to stay on shelves for so long, people felt this is just not okay, and en masse let, you know, Quaker Oats and the companies that own them know this. So interestingly though, Uncle Ben became something else. He's still Ben. He's like, I can't remember what they called the brand, but Ben still exists. Now, what did they do with the woman in this equation, who arguably was the larger character, the larger influencer? There's a huge story that I go into in my influencer marketing class about that brand mascot in real life and people that claimed to be Aunt Jemima that were hired to be, and there were different women and had different stories and different experiences, which are important to acknowledge. But at the end of the day, Quaker Oats and their parent company decided to sunset Aunt Jemima entirely. So the woman was retired out. So she doesn't exist anymore. So again, in this sort of male-female dynamic, isn't it interesting? I'm not sure what it says, and I'm not saying it's intentional, but isn't it interesting that, you know, the woman just kind of leaves the picture and yet the man gets to stay? Even though they're still based on really concerning tropes that, you know, hopefully are not repeated in society. It's sort of like when I think of that as bad, but I also, you know, tell people if they don't already know about the gollywog piece of
on the Robertson's
English
jam
culture. It was so problematic in the pub in Kent that's resisting calls to take their dolls out. And I mean, when I saw my then husband introduced it to me, and he kind of didn't tell me much about it. I think he wanted to see what my reaction was. And I was like, what is this? I thought it must be, you know, a farce or, you know, something comedic. And to know that it wasn't, you know, the minstrel show wasn't, it was, I almost couldn't believe that our countries coexisted with such different media at the same time. And that's not to say that the US is less race aware or less race forward at all. Because again, I think all systems have problems, and we haven't really, we're trying to address them, but it's piecemeal, and it's not in the interest of the powers that be in a lot of ways. But it is interesting when you look at those different examples, and you go around feeling this sort of sense of guilt or responsibility, and then you look at examples, in the same time period in other English speaking places, and are just like blown away by how that's allowed, or how people hang on to it now. I actually have one of his books, that's the Scallywag book that he had as a child. Somehow in my move back to the United States, some of his things ended up, and it wasn't, a big enough thing to ship back. And I've actually kept it as something I think of as maybe a teachable, it's put away. Obviously, it's not something I have out on a shelf, but it's in my storage. And I always think this might be something teachable at some point, to show people that this piece of, this book with a hard cover actually existed and actually portrayed these, portrayed individuals that way. And so in any event, I think we can be surprised by each other all day long, but I think, it's an evolution of culture.
Well, one thing I just want to touch on, and I don't want to take a whole day. Well, I do, but it's not fair if I do. One thing I want to touch on is we are, and we have the ability to connect with anybody, anywhere in the world, pretty much. You're in California, I'm in London, we're talking quite happily, we're getting on, and so we have the ability to connect with people from everywhere. With social media connects us with people from different countries, different cultures, etc. It feels two things. One, that we're perhaps less connected than we've been before. You read stats about the levels of people saying that they're lonely or don't have a best friend, or I think 57% of Americans say they eat every meal by themselves, even if they're in a relationship, in a family, they eat every meal by themselves. 50% say they're lonely at particular times. And I think also that we haven't grown our levels of empathy in a way that feels commensurate with the fact we are connected to each other. Does that ring true?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
okay.
In my own life, most meals in my household of 3 are eaten separately, often, fortunately or unfortunately, with an iPad or iPhone or something, playing some sort of media, whether it's music or a program. Right now, the Olympics is going on. We like figure skating, so we might have that on. And 2 of us might have it on in the same room, and we don't even know it. So, but I think the key thing is we do try one day a week to kind of come together to discuss it and maybe watch something together. This last week, it was very interesting because none of us could agree. We could not agree on the same media. And remembering also that in my situation, my brother is part of the equation, and with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, anybody that has that type of illness can, that you have a level where you're like, if something's quite depressing, it maybe isn't such a good thing for him to watch right before bed. Obviously it's his choice, his autonomy, but you might I might suggest we watch, reruns of Parks and Rec or The Office, whether it's, he loves the thick of it. I've introduced him to the thick of it. He absolutely loves it. He, of course, loves the later seasons that I don't like as much. But in any event, brilliant, brilliant show. Anything Iannucci is just gold for me. But, we just couldn't agree. So in that sense, we do some of those things, but we're also trying to compensate in other ways. So I think being intentional is the key in our worlds. Also like introducing him to different AI tools. So he used to ask me all the time and kind of stop my workday, which is fine. I want to talk to him, but again, to be productive, I probably can't get asked questions that could be answered on Google very simply in a search, right? But he's looking for conversation is really what it is. And so teaching him how to use the voice control option on, using Sora basically on OpenAI has been very helpful for him in some ways. But he also has me to kind of monitor it and make sure he is prone, I think, to forming a parasocial relationship with it, because it's hard to meet people, to be able to date and have social interaction with, for a lot of different reasons in the area that we live in, California. And I think a lot of people find that. I mean, for me, I would love to have more of a social life. I can't believe how little I don't do, or that might be going on in a, I could fly somewhere very quickly and just go up for the night and come back. And sometimes I do that, but it is an extra effort. It is an extra cost. And ultimately it's kind of, I'm constantly thinking, what are the devices that we can use in terms of technology to bring ourselves together in person where it's needed or where it's wanted? And even seeing, Columbia Journalism School is making this big effort right now to kind of bring in some, educational or other elements to get us involved in the school. And you realize that's probably happening around the timing seems interesting because, of course, the Trump administration had a big fight with the Columbia and about grants and that sort of thing, and for research to continue at a very expensive school in New York City, Ivy League, you're going to need your alums to be donors. So you probably should do and offer some. These are things they should have offered before, and I was always very vocal about and willing to offer whatever I could in terms of training or help, mentoring, whatever it might be. But now is becoming formalized, I feel like, because they want to make sure that they still have enough money for research and grants to keep things like the Pulitzer Prize continue to be awarded at Columbia, the DuPont, others to be awarded at Columbia. Those things can't stay there if they don't have these donations. So another thing that happened last year, besides the sort of continuing education they're offering right now, they gave us all will kits.
Okay.
So you could set up a will.
I'm sure that's depressing or just or responsible. Really.
I thought the same thing. And then obviously what they're trying to do is, give you the tools and this paid product to be able to set up your trust properly if you want to give a gift to the school upon your death. So it's not required, but it's kind of a clever device if it didn't cost them very much, or if hopefully they got the software for free.
If they ask you that, I guess.
But for me, it's then like, what did the school tell them about me? Because they're going to know a minimal amount about me to have given me something like this. So anyway, it's very interesting how all of these pieces fit together. And the thing I go back to is, during the pandemic, I think I said to you before we started recording, I was at this very transitional place of, being in San Diego, but my family's in sort of the middle of California. And, there are caregiving needs that I don't feel I can just, as my friend said, outsource. And so I'm going, how do I make this decision? How do I even have a group of people that can help me make this decision? And I just, when I did mention it to friends, it was always comments like, having them taken care of by other people, when I never had the fortune of having kids. So in a way, like, I'm able to be the more mobile of the family members to be flexible. And so, when I was really feeling caregiving was a burden and became aware of it in different ways, I didn't want to feel like it was a burden because it was a choice I was making. And so I decided, and I was very lucky that UC San Diego Center for Mindfulness, part of UC San Diego Health, had offered classes online. And, you talked about growing empathy. I think the key, for me at least, being a person I like to think is pretty naturally empathetic, having lived lots of different ways in my life and at a lot of different levels, going up, going down, back again, et cetera, that I needed tools to understand how to be nice to myself, because so many of us have that inner critic that's so loud.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I still feel like a failure for various things, for various reasons that I fight all the time. And I don't know how many people really go through this. My sense is just, from the little that I've seen online, is it's a fair amount of us do in different ways. We beat ourselves up. So I do think we don't really have a way to teach ourselves and to make it okay for us to be empathetic. I think even more so in other cultures. I think in England, for example, I think it would be even harder and I think that's why you see a lot more campaigning around empathy and mental health, which is centered more around giving yourself a break, I feel like, or allowing yourself to get help, but you do have universal health care.
We do.
And you know, having had my own experience of NHS care and waiting lists just to see a therapist, you know, in the huge transition I did moving, you know, from California to England, seemed like a reasonable thing, but I started to feel like, oh my God, to get to see this person takes months. I must be a nutcase to these people, you know, but, you know, and so kind of just being, you know, trying to stay calm in myself and kind of use some coping strategies from prior therapy was helpful. But I sort of thought, you know, gosh, what if people go on a list here? I mean, that would be so daunting to me if I've never really had an experience of therapy in my household. I suddenly am reaching out and, you know, like my, you know, and I think I said this to you that, you know, in the NHS, as I was using services initially, because we stayed with her and her husband at this time of our move initially until our house was ready. And, you know, just feeling like she was coming into appointments with me. Like she needed to supervise all of it. It was so, the sense of control was, and that was specific to her. It's not necessarily a cultural piece, but it is sort of telling about, you know, sort of this feeling we have about how we're portrayed. And sometimes I ask myself, is there room for empathy? You know, experiences that we should think of as being empathetic or going to the next step and getting some trauma-informed verbiage, language, oversight, you know, doing fertility marketing. So important in my view, if you're doing any kind of communications, if you look at EMR, electronic medical records software, coming out of the box, it's sexist, it's racist, it's just, it's ist of all the kinds, a lot of it. So it needs to be looked at and taken seriously, I think, by any marketer, you know, that's taking on even the smallest boutique clinic. But often it's just overlooked. And the software itself could just make you feel so self-conscious. So, you know, and the experiences actually that yield, and the way that I was able to bring that into a lot of clinics that I've worked with is to kind of point out the basics, you know. Gay men need surrogates, and the more processes you have, surrogacy, egg donation, et cetera, in a process of IVF, the more the clinic makes a profit. And there's more pure profit in those services, right? Those concierge type services. And so by pointing out that most of our forms didn't really allow for two men or a single man to show up as they might like to in a form, and them not to have the autonomy to, you know, identify how they want or whatever that might be, you know, it became basic business sense for them. Oh, well, we're ostracizing people. They see our forms and they might go away. And it's like, well, I'm seeing some bounce and, you know, some friction, and, you know, the conversion cycle takes a long time anyway, but it might be taking even longer with these. So there can be a lot of reasons for that you can look at, you know, from a marketing communication standpoint. But really, you're only in some ways as good as your communication. And if your communication is not even looked at by the people that own the business or that are the main stakeholders, or you don't point it out, like I always signed up for an account and could go in as a patient profile. So I knew what the patient portal was like if I was, you know, in charge of describing that to the patient, you know, whereas other people might just take that on and do it, and they might not ever log in and have that experience. But, you know, if you're having had my own journey in that world, you know, I had some familiarity with, you know, for example, male factor infertility and what that role might play, even just in getting men to get general health care, get one major health checkup in their lives, which is so important to prevent cancers, for example, and that are so preventable at those stages. But, you know, often the fertility clinic just farms you through, and they don't encourage just a check of the man. And there's so many things a urologist can identify, and it's so much about structure. You know, a lot of times, you know, at least here, a reproductive endocrinologist can be double board certified. So they've kind of become a doctor twice. They become an OBGYN, and then they've gotten the endocrinology fellowship training, and they could be double board certified if they choose. And that's, you know, the doctors I've had the fortune to work with have had that. So it's a very elite class of doctor. you can contrast that in kind of their terms, and you think about it. A urologist goes to medical school, specializes in urology, and comes out. They don't necessarily do extra fellowship training. Some do, but it's, you know, it's not as acknowledged as something that male factor infertility specialists who are urologists by trade maybe know very well. And so there's this sort of, you know, the elite system of medical education of who knows the most, who's going to understand fertility best. I would venture to guess, and I advise people all the time, an IVF specialist doesn't know shit about a woman's body, whereas a reproductive endocrinologist is a fully trained OBGYN. They can birth babies. They know what's going on in a woman in a way they do not know what's going on in a man. So there's a role to play for everyone, but you know, it kind of gets played down, unfortunately, in this country a lot by the commerce of it all. If it's cash pay and that sort of thing. And in the UK, it happens differently because there's systems that have always kind of worked a certain way, and you get funneled through a system. And when does the system get reviewed? You know, I mean, Wes Streeting is in office now as the health secretary, and he's looking at certain cancer treatments, for example. He has a lived experience of cancer, so he's bringing that to the table. Other friends of mine might be having other experiences in the NHS at the same time and going, I wish he would give as much attention to X as he's giving to cancers and that treatment system, and how those systems could be made better. So I think we're kind of always wrestling with empathy because it feels like an extra. It doesn't feel built in. And I think it's mostly around, you know, for me at least, probably having that early childhood experience at 8 of losing my dad overnight.
Yeah.
And, you know, trying to talk to my friends about it at school, and other little 8-year-olds going, oh yeah, I remember when my grandma or papa passed. And me thinking, this is someone I saw every single day. It was part of the structure of my life. It's completely different, as we know as adults, than, you know, if you lose somebody who's, you know, lives in a different house and you maybe see a couple times a month or maybe every weekend even, but it's just very, very, very different, the role that they play in your life. And, you know, for me, I wouldn't have understood it at the time, but like the financial security of our whole family, all of that sort of thing, our class standing, all of that could be affected by the death of this one key person. And missing them, you know, not feeling that relationship, not having the example, my mom not getting to stay married if she wanted to, or wherever that marriage may have led, but they were very much still in love when they were in the process of getting their vows renewed when he passed away. And so she was very much in love when he died, and to just have that snatched away. So, you know, being empathetic is something pretty foundational to my core, you know, to try to relate to people where they're at. Probably served me well when I ended up being a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan, and made me very interested in people and culture and how things are handled in a way that maybe other people aren't, for better or for worse.
Are you very comfortable putting your trust in other people? Do you allow people to take some of the burden sometimes?
I mean, I don't really feel like there's an alternative. I mean, that's I think of that in a very personal sense, sort of, you know, because caregiving is the biggest example. With Gavin Newsom in the state of California, trying to have this outsized footprint on the world because he wants to be, obviously, president. It can be frustrating because on a day-to-day basis, there are things that don't work in California. And I wish, you know, there was something going on you know, there was a climate conference that he was at this year, the big one everybody goes to, but I'm going like, does he really need to be there in Brazil when we're having X, Y, and Z happen here? We still don't have systems for the unhoused, people that choose to be unhoused or don't want to be compliant on medication or whatever. They want to, we have to have these debates in society about what's allowed even, because it can be against the law to not have a home, you know, essentially. And so you have to sort of, there's so much thought and process that's never been put into those things, even since it was all acutely manifesting during COVID. And he's been here for that. And I don't feel like we've moved the needle. For example, if I join the Peace Corps right now, I can go help a family or go live with a family in another country, helping as an English as a second language instructor, or doing other, teaching work. And I can earn an MBA, I can earn a master's, I can earn a PhD as I'm doing that. And I might have an interest in doing a PhD now, or really, or doing a law program or something like that. I am financially not incentivized in any way to do that as a caregiver. So if I just need to caregive full-time for a few months, I don't have any incentive to. So you can see society sort of breaking down, because if people are on these paths of there are things that are complementary, sort of learning while you're caregiving can be a nice give and take. That can work together potentially. Not always, not when things are acute, but usually those things work well together. But I can go take care of other people or try to help them, and I can invest in myself. And I'm not able to do that as a caregiver right now, as I'm caring on a day-to-day basis in home for my brother. That seems insane to me. I can't get, I don't have a gift card to give to my sister so she can take him to coffee. They're actually twins, and I wish they had more interaction. I know he misses her, but she sort of needs some incentive. If I had an excuse to kind of get him, that not only gives me a bit of respite, but it keeps him connected to other family members. We just miss those things in society. So I think we have to push for them. I think we have to kind of show and recognize it and talk about them. But, again, my experience of the Democratic Party is anyone really listening? Because everybody was so busy telling me what they thought should happen in X, Y, or Z experience that they hadn't had lived experience of, no matter what their particular background might be. So, you might have the lived experience, and because it's going to be contextual too. I mean, the experience of a white-facing woman like I am is very different than the lived experience of a Black woman. And in a way, you kind of have to have breakouts for those things if you're going to truly build empathy, so that they feel like, each group feels like they have a foundation. Now, I think one of the criticisms around sort of white men being maybe feeling piled on, the whole Piers Morgan criticism of it all, if you will. It has an interesting foundation, because you go, if white men felt like they had kind of a unifying force or something to come together with that wasn't negative, that wasn't Proud Boys, that wasn't MAGA, that wasn't maybe not political at all, but wasn't also an online forum where it's maybe centered around online porn, creating online porn, with the whole grok of it all recently. Other things that are negative in impact that are found to be negative in impact to women and girls, maybe we would be better off, because white men aren't incentivized necessarily to come together in the way that other groups are, because they're otherized. They're not the mainstream. But I think, we still need to recognize white men still need, whatever group of people still need to feel like they can come together. Maybe not about the whiteness, but maybe out of there's also the banality and the boringness too of kind of living corporate life. And you're so brave in choosing a different path and allowing a life experience to kind of help define a better way forward for yourself, or a different way forward. And I think there's something so admirable in people choosing to kind of look at those forks in the road and go, I'm going to take the path less traveled. And, and you find that for so many of those people, like with this podcast for you, there's very, very productive, wonderful things that can come of it. But often people don't feel they have that choice for some reason. It's societal pressure. Again, there's no outlet to kind of share those experiences and talk with one another. And it's been interesting to see, as jobs have become scarce in the United States, how my friend groups where we all came up online together and had, played different roles in the structure of companies and marketing programs, are feeling about, they're really feeling like there's an ageism issue, of people in their 50s not being able to get work, feeling unincentivized to even apply, because people are going to go, look at all this experience. Do I cut my experience off? Like, what do I do? Is there value in age anymore? Or is it considered sort of I'm going to be hired by a millennial or Xer who's going to think, ugh, they don't, so we talk about my book, Generationisms, the idea of value that comes with age and experience being like sort of good enough, is a huge issue for just employment for Gen Xers, and at least in my experience. And so oh God, I can think of so many friends right now that are going through this and have tried to kind of bring people together, and maybe even think about like monetizing, because they have to live, bringing people together. Does that make sense? There's so many platforms that allow for that. But again, just based in real life, I think there's kind of nothing that replaces real life. And a lot of I think the question for yourself is like, how many people would you feel comfortable messaging or doing a quick video call with after you message and they realize that you're needed or whatever, and you're at home at 11 and you're crying and you have no makeup on and you feel like you don't even think about how you look. It doesn't matter. There are, there's less than 5 people I can think of that I would probably do that. And it's less about the sort of makeup and everything. It's more about the kind of internal like facade that we put on and almost are acting out to protect ourselves. Particularly if we've had highly demanding roles. You've had certainly that in your career where you've had to almost, a lot of people that I know that have had those kinds of roles in financial services, real estate, et cetera, have had to be very hard in their careers. And it's maybe not your natural personality. I remember, I think back sometimes of, tape editors I worked with when I was starting out in news and doing news producing for 5 p.m. news, and all the different news stories that broke at the very last minute. And I had this amazing tape editor, Matt Lefebvre, who's become very successful at what he does. But, I yelled at him so terribly, and I was really known for my output. So I got a good result from what I was doing. So at the time I didn't think to myself, I shouldn't be yelling at someone like this. This is awful. So I look back now and I go, God, I feel like I should reach out to Matt and say sorry, or something like that. And it just would feel so misplaced. He's like a very successful sports announcer now, and, known for that. So it's, it's like, it seems like he, it wasn't as, a monumental thing for him, but it's sort of like almost a 12-step program, empathy. It's sometimes you got to kind of look back and somehow make peace with decisions that you made, and hope you can rationalize it to yourself that you just didn't know any better.
I mean, certainly when I was first coming out, I remember having things thrown at me on my desk, being sort of swept onto the floor, or being sort of shouted at, whatever.
Potentially.
I'm not saying that was good at all, but
exactly.
I do think there is hopefully there's a lot more sensitivity today. It is, and I don't want to sort of sidetrack you a little bit, but I do find Gavin Newsom an interesting character. I mean, he was at Davos this week. He was at a Munich security conference. It's like, well, are you ever in California? And I know the USA you should dress for the job you want. It's almost, he's trying to do the job he wants, not do the job that he's got. And is there a feeling that he'll be there? Do you think he'll be the nominee? I know it's still 3 years away. Do you think he's got? I
think it's very possible. I think he really wants it, and that's a lot of the equation.
He really wants it.
The party in California really likes him for it. I think the question for me is whether the national party will like him for that role. I mean, I think he has some interesting crossover appeal that folks don't know about. His wife having been a Republican for most of her life. His ex-wife famously, when I was living in San Francisco, he was mayor. And I remember Kimberly Guilfoyle, being a prosecutor on a high-profile case that I was covering at ABC at the time. So, they were like this power couple, this local power couple, and, their wedding was really celebrated and all of that. And, it kind of felt fake at the time. I don't know. I didn't feel like it was the most sincere thing. And you kind of go, are those marriages ever really like that? Considering, I mean, they're very successful in their own right now. He's the governor of a state, potentially running for president, and here she's an ambassador to somewhere. But, there is this sort of joke about him and conservative women as a result of that. But what's more concerning to me is, when I paid for something recently on a state of California website, and when I went through the payment process, it said something about Siebel Systems, and I'm like, wait, is this a company or subsidiary of his wife's family? Because they're huge tech family, tech money family. And I'm guessing I got so upset I didn't even look into it, but I went, God, if the governor's wife's family is making money off of me, this may have been in place far before he was ever elected governor, but it's just not a good look, is kind of, where you end up at the end of the day, because there's so many programs that just don't work well. And, taxation is still problematic.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's a great idea to be doing this billionaires tax and driving billionaires out of our state. The ones that want to leave anyway, go for it. Like, nobody's forcing you to live in California. And if there are other places to live, great. And I do think that they, like anyone else, should be paying their proportion. But let's face it, the thing we're not facing is that the people with the highest tax burden are the middle class.
Yeah.
It's just always how it is. Democrats are not making it better. They're basically making it easier to be poor. So nobody's getting empowered necessarily. And nobody in the middle class, I'm not hearing anything convincing that's making me go, oh yeah, I'll be able to attain X, Y, Z, that my parents were able to attain and maybe more easily or facilitated more simply. I don't feel that at all. I feel more confusion. My brother has various government assistance programs, some run by the state. And I remember during COVID, a really good example, a friend of mine has got a payment processing platform, and they have debit cards, so Visa debit cards. And, he had this real passion for getting first responders these, financial assistance just in the form of a Visa card at no cost to them, and getting donors behind that through this organized effort. So I'm on the board and I'm on the calls every week trying to get this done in a very succinct period of time. And at one point, somebody had floated the idea of EBT, which is our food stamps program. So that we were looking at a different kind of segment of first responders. So maybe nurses and other folks that unfortunately don't make enough money in their work, their primary work, to be able to afford healthcare or other basic essentials. So this was meant to help solve the gap. So as we were going through the pandemic, I'm also, caregiving for the first time, really hands-on, and going, I'm taking my brother everywhere to go to the store for the things he buys that are at stores that I don't go to. And remember, it was such a big deal. We would like wipe things down or, get them delivered, and he could never have things delivered. I'm like, why can you just not buy things on Amazon? Is there a reason? Like, is there something I don't understand? In parallel with working on this idea of like, okay, we'll use the EBT system to get people money very quickly. Well, my brother was like trying to explain to me, I can't use it on Amazon. I go, well, what do you mean? You have a card, right? Yeah, I can't use the card on Amazon. Why can't you use the card? So it's like a who's on first conversation, right?
Yes.
He said, because it doesn't have the thing. And I said, what do you mean the thing? So he brought it physically to me and said, it doesn't have the thing. And so I was comparing my card to his card. He meant like a Visa or MasterCard logo. So the state of California has a payment processor that's not Visa or MasterCard certified or at that level. And it may be because there's a payment processing fee, but what that actually meant during the pandemic is the most vulnerable people like him who have lung problems and other things that shouldn't be going out in stores were actually having to go out to stores because they couldn't use things online. And then when the state rolled it out, it was only at select retailers. So I think Amazon and Walmart kind of had the monopoly of the places that my brother shops. So he wasn't able to really do massive price checking, or if he wanted to buy local. I mean, we all want to buy local, right? Couldn't do that. So if I'm trying to encourage my brother to have this healthy, organic, as much as possible lifestyle, which you would think would be the foundation of really good mental health, is eating well, not eating processed foods. Ultra processed foods are bad for us. We know this. And they don't help with our mental health. And they're, more and more learning how bad they are really in terms of contributing to illness. Anyway, the irony was I came back to the next board meeting and was like, did you guys know EBT cards in California are not run on a Visa or MasterCard platform? Like they're not partnered with, and I forget what that all is called. I knew at the time what all the verbiage was around that, but it was unbelievable to me because it really brought up questions about like, what is the bidding system? Have the company that runs it said they just always had it and then they're quickly rolling out online uses for it? Was that available all along? And yet for almost a year, they made people go in stores that maybe were the least likely to need to be forced to go in a store, right? Like that most vulnerable, needed to be shielded the most. It's sort of like those lived experiences, those disconnects that I would love to go over with Gavin Newsom, because you only get to them if you actually meet with people and listen. And I think he's in an echo chamber of Democrats who are feeling really disappointed and very upset, distressed, concerned, for a lot of good reasons. I'm there too, but I don't know that like everything with the Democratic Party, I think everybody's well-intentioned, but I just don't know that they're listening. Mm-hmm. Know your target market is one of the things we started this conversation with, right? And understanding these nuances between generations, and that kind of being one of the pieces, at least for me, that is where empathy starts, trying to relate and understand people, using what we know sociologically, anthropologically, and through sort of history and other mechanisms to relate to one another and figure out what those touchstones are to even get a conversation going, besides weather, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's
so I was just going to say, and I mean, we won't get into it now, otherwise we'll be here another 5 hours. But that's one thing that, from an observation point of view, that Donald Trump and his team seems to do very well in the last election. Because Donald Trump is a 80-year-old billionaire, thrice divorced, so many kids, multiple lawsuits. On paper, you couldn't put down somebody less likely to become the president. But going on Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, reaching out to people, somehow convincing very poor people, very young people, very old people, actually, he was in their corner, and changing the news narrative so quickly they can never fact check what he said and move on to the next thing, which is completely. And I hope the next election doesn't follow the same pattern. It gets back to more informed debate and more informed discussion. But it does feel that was a big change. So my final question, and I'll let you get on with your day. My final question would be, bear in mind everything talked about and your very broad experience and your global experience, are you more hopeful than not about the future? And I would say the future of America.
An optimist.
Optimist, okay.
Well, about the United States of America specifically?
Yeah, because I think at the moment, I think America is navigating a very different position in the world to what it's perhaps historically had. And sure, some of it was wrong, and that Europe should have stood more on its own 2 feet for a long time, and America's funded NATO.
That gave the U.S. control, though. There's different ways of looking at all of that. Look, I grew up with the polarity of the former Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States as being kind of the different and the role of the EU and all of that was in its nascent form, right? Yeah. So in growing up through those changes and following, the euro and the different countries coming into it, remember what a big deal it was when Italy was accepted in, and like what that did to the currency and how people could buy things or not.
Absolutely, yeah.
But what the United States did really well for so long was, whether this is a good thing or bad thing, I don't know, but having control, and control through what are put out there as auspicious aid programs. So at key times, and I did aid work in Iraq when there was the red and green zone, and I was very uncomfortable in the green zone with the way that the vehicles from the U.S. State Department, for example, would just drive over roads in front of these vehicles that we were in, for this aid organization I was working with, that could be decimated by the vehicle. It's got the scrambler in the front and all kinds of, bulletproofing around it. I got to see the U.S. Embassy, and it's like a college dorm town with a subway and everything. It's like little America. And that made me feel so sad, you know, because it was like, you know, I'm sure this is not what this country is going to continue to want or sustain or choose. It's just not true of the culture. And so there's lots of, you know, sort of moments in my life. Oh my gosh, it's asking me if I'm still here. Yes, I'm still here. So I think that the one thing is, I think that future generations, and maybe some of mine, will have to deal with the loss of control and standing in the world. I can't remember an Olympics where my representative from the government or whatever, like JD Vance and his wife, were booed.
I know.
But at the same time, in the last year, I've worked with someone I have come to adore, a client that did a podcast, you know, recovery and addiction themed podcast, because that's her area, that's where her PhD is in, and did the most in-depth interview I've ever seen with Bev Vance Aikens, his mother. So I actually worked on something that for some of my friends was like, oh my God, I can't believe she'd work on that kind of content. But the whole idea was that it wasn't political. It was trying to really understand a recovery journey and document it in a way that this particular person really admired my client, who has this PhD and has written a recovery workbook, for example, that she used and really helped her apparently, and just admired her so much. So they were able to come together and make this incredible content that's out there in the world that I'm very proud to have been a part of, because I hope that it will help people and it will help reduce stigma. Because, you know, she looks like a little, you know, almost like a grandma type figure, and, you know, she's cute and sassy and peppy. But hearing her talk about, you know, waking up every morning, thinking, how am I going to manipulate people to get high, makes you go, it tells you so much about what that must be like as her son. Even though he's given his own account of things, it's different to kind of hear the mother's point of view.
Definitely.
So there's the Olympics of it all. I think I was wondering what the Olympics would be like, and it is very frustrating. I do not agree with most of Donald Trump's choices. I don't think he has ethics or the sense of morality that I think we used to hold up in the United States. Whether it was really true behind closed doors or not, I don't know. But I think that what happens over time is we do have cyclical elections and styles of government. And I'm very much hoping that we're just cycling through. I mean, like everyone else, I have family members that voted for him and they voted against their own best interests. In a lot of ways, I may benefit from his tax programs, to be honest, but I would trade that for U.S. aid coming back in a heartbeat, because people are dying of completely preventable diseases. People are dying for lots of different reasons all over the world, in our own country. I mean, if you're going to take money from more of the middle class and put it towards anything, I don't want it to be on a $730 million jet for the Department of Homeland Security to then go to Minneapolis and for some reason shoot 2 American citizens in really horrific circumstances that don't seem justified through the on-the-ground creator video I've seen. And I don't appreciate being gaslit, because this is also ironically a time when we should be having, women and girls in particular should be protected more, and laws about coercive control are coming in Australia, the UK, having had that happen to me and realizing how central gaslighting is to that. And I don't like to talk a lot about that, but I do bring it up because it is its own unique experience. And once you've had it and you kind of heal from it, you go, okay, buddy, I don't even gaslight me, because you're not going to be able to. Okay, I can see what's happening here. And I can see pros and cons. I think if it makes some people feel more proud of the United States, that's great. But I don't see the huge morality there. I see a lot of international problems with us on the world stage and our ability to have power, which is ultimately, whatever you think of it, the ability to have money. Just look at our tech billionaires. Yes. Our tech billionaires are incentivized, it seems, more than ever to just make money at whatever costs to people. There's no real humanity in that. That sort of culture is encouraged and proliferates. But I'm hopeful that we will cycle out of that and something better will come, even though I've had some up close and personal experiences that make me go, it's not just the Democratic Party. it's also that, the Republican Party well, it's really the Trump Party, right? Because my grandfather was a Republican, and we had fascinating debates. I mean, I learned so much from him that it made me very centrist, actually, growing up. Even though I always identified as a Democrat, I was always very centrist. I was a big, before Monica Lewinsky and what he did there, I was, a big fan of Bill Clinton, and, and was very active about that. But the thing is, I just think that, nothing's going to be fixed overnight. Putting tariffs in obviously doesn't happen overnight, and we also aren't going to level out, and our economy isn't going to come back to a normal point either. So I think there's some real damage that's been done, maybe a generation's worth. I think more could be done depending on how the rest of his he wants to he teases constantly staying in office or running again. I think we're going to find the Constitution hopefully will be tested and find that that's not possible. But I sort of have to be hopeful. I think we're at a time, it's like the boom, bust time. It reminds me so much of that, where there's so much uncertainty. And, part of my role, I think, in coming in as a consultant was to go, you know what, it's here to stay. Maybe now I have more power to be on boards and try to attract or go to or create organizations that help provide oversight. I think there's more leaders needed, especially female, to be reached out to join boards, to make time, even though most of us are very busy, to try to be part of that, because part of the Trump administration's motto is sort of money at any cost in a way. And I think that's the issue with AI, is the guardrails are clearly not there. And as someone who, during the boom, bust, would sit in so many Silicon Valley meeting rooms and hear guys go on and on about when the singularity is going to happen. And now seeing and going, there's a fully functioning debate that could be had about whether we've already achieved that or not, given that there's now a social network for these AI agents to meet and have conversation. A lot of it, looking into it, seems pretty innocuous. But, my mom has always been very tech savvy, for example, and trying to explain that to her has not worked yet. And we're getting to that level of complexity where not everybody can be part of the conversation, which ultimately is going to make it inherently more Wild West and allow these leaders that don't seem to have the same moral compass and or have a leadership top down in the United States that doesn't really have a moral compass that I agree with, and I am concerned about it. But I do think that means more of us need to step up, and I am an optimist. I think the open source nature, or the free level of access to most of these tools, mean that we should go out there, we should look at the terms and conditions, and we should integrate the learning into whatever discipline we're working within, we're functioning within. And whether, how pro-business or not one is, all of these other pieces can be debated. I think I can be very pro-business and anti the billionaire tax in California, but still identify as a Democrat and have a lot of ideas for how things could be improved. I think, the concern is that there's a leadership vacuum. And, I think the coverage will be interesting, because since I watch so much international coverage, I think I will see in the UK more positives around Gavin Newsom, because someone like Denise Welch, some of these people on Loose Women that, kind of lead dialogues in certain quarters are going to have lots of wonderful things to say about him, because he seems young and like the antithesis to what our choices were at the last election. But like anything else, it's not that simple.
No. So on that note of optimism, thank you so much for your time. You've been so generous with your time, and we went to places that I never imagined we could do. No, it was really, really good. So I'll let you enjoy your day, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, very good. Let me know what the next steps are and all of that.